Do you feel like you are the most emotionally regulated person that you know? But is it really emotional regulation or is it emotional dysregulation? If you grew up as a parentified child, it is likely that you were the most emotionally regulated person in your family. But most people who grew up as parentified children actually have a lot of emotional dysregulation. It just looks very different than what we picture when we think about emotional dysregulation. So, this is really a hidden cost of parentification, and it gets missed by everybody, often including the person who grew up parentified. So, understanding this can help point you in the direction of a piece that might be missing from your healing journey. Because true emotional regulation has been tied to happiness in lots and lots of research. And I think it's intuitive. When we do feel emotionally regulated, we feel way better. So, what is actually happening to the child who is growing up who's emotionally parentified is that they are learning to suppress their own emotions in order to take care of others. They suppress whatever needs they might have, anger, disappointments, desires. None of that is processed or validated or acknowledged or understood. It's just pushed way down in order to not upset a volatile parent or in order to caretake for somebody else in the family. So, what happens long term is that that person probably grows up with a lot of anxiety. It's also likely that the person who grew up parentified feels a lot of guilt and resentment that can really, really weigh you down and be very depressing. And then often numbness kicks in. So I think that when we really suppress all of our emotions and we don't learn how to process them and deal with them, but we're just pushing them down, the ones that leak out, in my view, are anxiety, guilt, resentment, and numbness. Now, if you think there's another one that kind of leaks out when you're suppressing your emotions, comment below, let me know. But those are the ones that I've seen the most in my work with people. When I was working as a psychotherapist, I worked with a lot of people who grew up parentified. And they saw themselves as sort of the calm one, the competent one, which they were. But the backlash from all of that was a struggle with anxiety or depression or some of those other difficult emotions. So, one reason that this cost of parentification stays hidden, that we don't recognize the emotional dysregulation, is that most of us tend to think of emotional dysregulation as those people who have big emotions, big angry outbursts, say, or somebody who's bipolar who goes from manic to depressed, or somebody with borderline personality disorder where their emotions are so volatile. So, those are the kind of situations we think of when we think about people who are very emotionally dysregulated. And they are. But that's the external manifestation of emotional dysregulation. We can also have a lot of emotional dysregulation that's all internal. So, say somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder, many people can hide it completely, but internally, there's a lot of emotional dysregulation. The high functioners that we know who have a lot of anxiety, but they don't let it out, right? So, just because we appear emotionally regulated doesn't mean we really are. So, let's talk about why this emotional dysregulation happens in a child who grows up parentified. Ideally, a parent would be helping a child learn to emotionally regulate. And a lot of this can be very instinctual if the parent has reasonable emotional regulation and if the parent was nurtured, right? So, a lot of the instinct is that you learn how to sort of soothe a baby when you have an infant. You help the baby calm down if it needs to go to sleep, or you might help the baby sort of energize and wake up. There's very instinctual means of helping infants, like tiny infants, emotionally regulate. And Even the parent's own ability to breathe and calm themselves is emotionally regulating for an infant. And then as the child grows up, and now I'm talking here about the good enough parent. Nobody does this perfectly, but in an ideal situation, you have a good enough parent, right? And the good enough parent, as the child is growing up, will help the child identify emotions, label them, validate them, understand why they're happening, and then also problem solve what to do about it. So, unfortunately, what happens if a parent does not have access to emotional regulation, right? They're incredibly dysregulated and they look to the child to help them regulate, right? That's what a parent is doing. If it's basically letting the child know, like, you can't be upset because I have to do this, or you have to take care of this for me because I can't cope. And again, I know people get very sort of anxious when I talk about this because they're like, well, in some situations, don't you have to do that? So I'm really talking about a consistent pattern where it is unreasonable for the parent to be looking to the child to suppress their emotions so that they can take care of the adult's emotions. It's a consistent pattern, and the child is not helped to learn any emotional regulation. So the child learning to read other people's moods so that they can help regulate them, right? Calm this person down, help that person function, keep the siblings quiet so the parent doesn't get mad. The child develops a lot of emotional intelligence in terms of picking up on other people's emotions, but not much in terms of understanding their own emotions. So, the most critical insight to take away here when the emotional regulation system is reversed, right? The child is supposed to help the parent regulate, is that the child is not learning emotional regulation. The child is learning emotional suppression. Yet the emotional suppression is disguised as regulation. I'd love to know if that makes sense to you and if understanding that is helpful for you. So let's talk about what true emotional regulation is. And if you want more on this topic, again, drop me a note because I think it's a super important topic. And oh, by the way, if you're getting value out of this video, please do subscribe. It's a big help to me, and hit that like button. Okay, so what is true emotional regulation instead of pseudo regulation? As I go through these components of true emotional regulation, I also want you to keep in mind that nobody does this perfectly. Nobody. I've never met somebody. We're human, right? But increasing your ability to do each one of these things can be really helpful long term. So, with healthy emotional regulation, our moods still go up and down, but they stay within a zone of tolerance. Now, the term zone of tolerance comes from psychotherapist speak, but I think it's intuitive what that means because when people get manic or like way too excited or way too anxious, way too up, or way too depressed, way too low, it can cause real significant problems. People can stop functioning. Those states are very, very painful. So, really allowing yourself to have what emotions you have, not suppressing them, not ignoring them, allowing them and learning how to listen to them and learning what to do when they're talking to you will then help you stay within that zone of tolerance. So, people who have healthy emotional regulation still get angry, they still get sad, they still experience grief and might have an extended period of grief. This is not about shutting off our emotions. It's more about learning to see them as information that's very, very valuable. Emotions can guide some really good decision making if we learn to think about them, understand when they're overblown and maybe we're triggered by some event in the past. So, calming down those overblown reactions, but not ignoring them. So I know there's sort of some subtle differences here in terms of how to manage emotions. But let me go through some pretty clear components. So, number one is awareness, noticing emotions as they arise, noticing the physical feeling that goes with the emotion. And the sooner we're aware of, oh, yeah, that's what I'm feeling, right? Then the easier it is to regulate our emotions. So, awareness is one. Next is labeling the emotion. Now, this can be hard. Sometimes we don't know what we're feeling, and that's okay too. And often we have many feelings at once. So it can be very confusing because you can have really conflictual feelings about different situations. But labeling emotions actually pulls in a part of the brain that helps you regulate. So I did a whole video on that. I'll try to link that here. But label the emotion the best you can, even if it's to say, I'm feeling upset, I'm feeling a lot of stuff, and I don't yet know exactly what. That's okay too. It sometimes can take a few days to figure out, what is it I'm really feeling? So allow yourself that. So, number three is acceptance, accepting your emotions, not judging them as good or bad. I shouldn't have this one. I should have that one instead. Accept your emotions. Validating them would be another way to say this. Validate the emotions that you're having. We tend to judge emotions as good or bad, reasonable or unreasonable. But honestly, really, it's the actions we take that can be reasonable or unreasonable. So, right now, we're just talking about listening to your emotions and accepting them. And then, number four is processing your emotions. So, processing your emotions probably could be broken down into a lot of other categories. But processing emotions is about understanding what information that emotion is giving you. All emotions, right, give us information. Processing could be understanding a trigger or understanding why you had an emotion that was really, really strong or perhaps overblown. What triggered you? Why, right? So, processing the events and the emotions that came out of those events is part of emotional regulation. And it does require some emotional intelligence. Now, understanding what your emotions are telling you, right? I do have a bunch of videos on different emotions. I have a playlist called Emotional Intelligence. And then in my Roadmap to Joy program, I actually have an entire section on deepening self knowledge, which goes into what different emotions mean and why they come up and how to interpret them. And that's actually section number 5 of that program because the first parts of the program are really about emotional regulation techniques, learning mindfulness, meditation, learning healthy boundaries. So all of this stuff definitely goes together. And the next component of emotional regulation is self soothing. Now, these all kind of go together because self soothing is going to help you with your acceptance of emotions. It's going to help you with your processing of emotions, right? So, these aren't necessarily like this is the order you have to go in, but these are all components and learning various self soothing techniques that are healthy, not, for example, alcohol or drugs, which might shift your mood very quickly but are biphasic, have a backlash, but really more learning how to breathe calmly, learning whether going for a walk helps you, petting an animal, what helps you re regulate your physiology. So, self soothing, I would really put into the category of physical regulation. Hopefully that made sense. The sixth component of emotional regulation is choosing your response. So often our behavior is reactive, super reactive. And for somebody who grew up parentified, the reactivity might be an automatic helping somebody else, automatically saying yes to something you'd really rather say no to, automatically picking up that the other person is feeling anxious and then figuring out what you can do about it instead of recognizing your own anxiety, right? So those reactive reactions, I'm trying to think if there's a better way to say that. But in any case, responding, not reacting. So really figuring out, okay, I had this emotion. What do I want to do? Not every time that we're angry at somebody do we need to say something. Really, sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. Being able to choose your response. Reactivity is where we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? That's a reactivity. That's the old stuff just triggering us and triggering our behavior. Once we've processed emotions and processed the situation, we can make a good decision about what behavior will come out of that situation. What response do we want to choose? Obviously, that's a very complicated topic, but I think that just thinking about it that way and looking for what is the best response on my part from this situation rather than what do I automatically feel like I have to do. And then number 7 is really understanding boundaries, really developing healthy boundaries. This long term will help you remain emotionally regulated. And then also, emotional regulation helps you have healthy boundaries. They kind of go together. But healthy boundaries, really understanding where do you end and somebody else begin? Where, what is your responsibility? What emotional realm is yours? And understanding that other people's emotions are their responsibility to take care of. So it's boundaries in terms of a very deep understanding of how we operate as humans. It's about cutting that enmeshment that happens with parentification that I talked about last week. It's about healing from that enmeshment, I should say. And once we heal from that enmeshment, we can be individuated, we can be our own individuals, and we can care. And we can sometimes caretake and sometimes receive support. We can move towards more interdependence in our relationships. All right. I really hope this was helpful. Let me know. Very interested to know. Check out some of my other videos. Check out that roadmap program. It also has a big piece on boundaries. Lots of people have found it to really help them lower anxiety, develop healthy boundaries, improve their relationship with themselves, which is really long term our most important relationship. We're with ourselves our whole lives. All right. Take care. See you next week.